Okay, so we'll take a look at this again. We think about this as a financial crisis, and we think, well, what's really the major fault line here? Well, you can see the idea of $2 trillion worth of unconventional mortgages issued in the United States at this time. That ultimately amounts to $2 trillion that people are not actually going to pay back. I mean, that's the kind of underlying story there. So I said previously, in some cases, mortgages extended to people with no credit or poor credit, or they clearly couldn't afford it. In some cases, mortgages extended to people who didn't have any intention of keeping the house, but were just going to hold on to it for 3 or 4 years and then sell it down the line. Why? Because it will be worth more 3 or 4 years from now. Of course, that plays into the general mantra of the prices of houses always increases. They're always more valuable in the future, so you can just flip the house over a short period of time and make more money. So a lot of these mortgages were just people who were planning on keeping the house and then selling it at a profit down the line. In other words, trillions of dollars are created which don't actually exist because they're not going to be paid back by any one person. There's this idea that the banking sector was to blame for this, and I guess you could say they were for extending mortgages to people who couldn't afford them. Also, investment banks as well. Investment banks are not banks that deal with individual customers. You don't go to an investment bank for a loan. They're basically the banks that work in the City of London. They just take wealth that's already been earned, accumulated, and they just reinvest it. And here was the major trigger in the 2008 crisis when Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest investment bank in America, went bust, at last alerting people to the scale of the catastrophe. And this was a situation analogous to 1929. The stock market crash could have been worse than 1929, actually, were it not for the interventions of the state. The key point there, though, is that like others, Lehman Brothers was stolen with toxic mortgages. And this kind of gets to the heart of the crisis. On the one hand, of course, you can blame the banking sector. But on the other hand, what's really incredible about this is the way that everyone drank the Kool-Aid. Everyone was kind of complicit in the disaster that occurred. What's really going on here? You have this loan of £300,000 that's extended to an individual so they can buy a house. And the individual gets the money, gets the house, and says, yes, I'm rich. I have a home for myself. The bank says, yes, we're rich. We're going to get this loan of £300,000 paid back to us over a steady monthly basis. An investment bank says, yes, we're rich. We're getting the asset. We're getting the mortgage down the line. And there's this whole idea that the individual who gets the loan will indeed have this money at some point in the future. Ties into this whole idea of the country, the economy will be richer in the future, except they're not going to make that money. They can't make that money. They don't have the means to make that money. Thus, nobody's rich in that situation because the money will not be paid back. So when the amount is canceled, there's a foreclosure and it drains the economic strength of the country. With the disintegration of the housing market and the stock market, household wealth losses in the UK between 2008 and 2009 exceeded £1 trillion. In the United States, the median household wealth in America was cut in half. So what really happens with a bank like Lehman Brothers? They say, oh my God, this is a disaster. We're losing millions and millions of dollars. We're losing all of our assets. But what's really occurring in that situation is you, the customer, you, the citizen, are losing the ability to make that money. You can't actually make that money in the economy through your job, through the kind of work you do. Cost of living is too high, incomes are too low, inflation is too bad. All of those things combine together. So basically it taps into the story, the underlying story, which is that economic growth is not as robust as we're led to believe. Our lives are not getting better the way that we're led to believe. And if everyone kind of buys into that narrative, it just produces this giant disaster, which is effectively what happened in 2008 with this giant stock market crash. As I said, could have been worse than 1929. It's actually the lessons learned from 1929 which led to a kind of a different policy approach. Changes will take us into the question of central banks and currency, because this actually became the driving force in alleviating the worst of the 2008 crash, and central banks also played a role after the COVID crash as well. And this has become the story of the driving force in ongoing economic growth, which again, if you check GDP numbers every year, you're led to believe that the countries are getting richer over time. Well, in part, thanks to central banks, they're getting richer, which when you understand this will be really kind of a remarkable thing. Role of central banks, flushing money into the economy, and the financial crisis in Iceland, because there is a very interesting story which economists have been talking about, well, basically since it happened, and probably will be talking about a long time in the future, because proportionally speaking, that was probably the largest financial crisis of any country, with all three of the banks melting down over a short period of time, obviously coinciding with the larger international crisis. The central bank, you see the Central Bank of Iceland, Central Bank of Iceland. Central bank is a bank that oversees financial policy for a country, including its currency and commercial banking sector. So that's not a conventional bank in the sense that people invest money into it. No, it's more the kind of overseer of the economy of the country as a whole. And one of the things that makes central banks unique is that in theory their role is not to earn money or compete on the market. How do you like that for a financial institution? So an institution that is centrally involved in the economy, but unlike just about everything else, right, in a capitalist society, their role is not to make money. That's not what they're supposed to be doing. They're just supposed to be arbitrating the flow of money within society. Their official purpose is to provide economic stability in the state, regardless of political issues. That's why central banks have become this curious a bastion that is supposed to be above partisan politicking. I would say the United States Federal Reserve provides a really kind of interesting case study in that regard, because that's the central bank of the United States, and it has indeed played a role that's been separate from all the polarizing politics of America. That was especially true during the COVID crisis as well. The U.S. Federal Reserve acted very quickly, and it was really a bipartisan initiative, their action, whereas Democrats and Republicans would fight and argue about just about anything else. But in this case, there was instantaneous action from the Federal Reserve. The U.S. Federal Reserve is authorized to create U.S. dollars when necessary, and that's what they've been doing, not just in 2008, but I would say for the last 15 years or more. In 2008, the Fed launched its famous bank bailout, purchasing toxic assets from collapsing banks for an initial total of $700 billion U.S. dollars, which amounted to flushing money into the banks to keep them from failing. Lehman Brothers had failed, but there are others that were looking very creaky at that point. So the last kind of stop, the last kind of bulwark, U.S. Federal Reserve steps in and basically gives a bunch of money, a whole lot of money, billions of dollars to the banks to prevent them from collapsing. And the Bank of England, Central Bank of the UK, did the same thing. British Prime Minister Gordon Brown announced a $500 billion bailout package for Britain's failing banks barely an hour before Britain enacted its anti-terrorism law against Iceland, which we'll talk about. Obviously, the average person hated this because there was a giant financial crisis going on. People were losing their homes, and it was the banks, Wall Street, and the city that was effectively saved in this situation. And they obviously represent the wealthiest class already in society. So I'm sure there were a lot of CEOs and super managers that actually made money out of the crisis, propping up the financial institutions as opposed to the people. The actions of central banks amount to flushing money into the economy. That's basically what they do. They create money, generate money, because they have this perception that the banks are short of money, or the people are short of money, or whoever. We're all short of money, right? So the bank is this kind of last stop to create money to allow for more wealth to exist within the country. Crucial question is, where does this money actually come from? Central bank is creating money. Where does it actually come from? Well, from nowhere, you might be surprised to hear. Money doesn't grow on trees, and there are no free lunches. Isn't that true? Well, yeah, for us, that's true, right? For just about everybody in the world, that's true. It's not true for the U.S. Federal Reserve, though. It's not true for a central bank. They're authorized by the state to generate money out of nothing. So the government goes to them and says, we need a lot of money. We need $700 billion. Person sits down, enters that number into a computer. Click, 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 click. there, I just created that money and dumped it into the economy. It is the ultimate example of cheap cash. Cash that's not been earned. It's not based on anything. It's not backed by gold, not backed by anything significant or substantial, and that alleviates the immediate crisis. So if you wonder where economic growth is coming from, well, from nowhere. Increasingly, it's just cheap cash that circulates through the economy and helps go a long way toward explaining inflation today. Because when you have a lot of cheap cash in the economy, it inevitably leads to higher prices because the currency is worth less. So inflation, which we've been talking about for the last couple of years, is a kind of knock-on effect. This is basically what they've been doing since 2008. As I said, they were doing it during COVID on an even bigger scale. I forget the numbers, but over $1 trillion in the case of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Interesting story here. So the role of central banks has been increasing over time, and this is a kind of really curious thing. Remember what I said about the modern capitalist society, the money trail. Trace the money trail. Look at where wealth is actually being generated. Look at where the money is coming from. And thus you can see the locus of power and influence in society. Well, central banks, look at the size of their total assets and balance sheets. Here you have a couple of examples of the European Central Bank, Federal Reserve, that's the American one, Bank of Japan, and the Bank of England. They have these gargantuan asset sheets that have been generated arbitrarily out of nothing. Thus, their roles are much more important, even though they don't actually make any money in and of themselves, but they're playing increasingly important roles in holding the economy together and also, at least ostensibly, being above the partisan politicking in countries like America. Same story in Europe right now. The COVID-19 crisis has exposed the preeminent role the European Central Bank is playing in the European Union right now. This is the equivalent of the U.S. Federal Reserve in Europe, and they're basically overseeing the circulation of euros in the European economy, located in Frankfurt. And you could say that the European Central Bank has sort of become this sort of figurehead of the European Union. Think of the EU, all these different countries and all the different conflicts that exist between them, different economies, you could even say different cultures. Yeah, but if you have a central bank that holds everything together, then they're playing that kind of role of the linchpin. They too have been involved in this process of quantitative easing, as they call it. Quantitative easing is just a fancy word for throwing money into the economy. I should point out, however, that there are limits to this kind of approach because not every country's central bank can actually engage in this process. It's actually a very small number of them that can do this. And there you see some of the major currencies in the world today. These are the banks that have control over these very important international currencies. Not just important in their own countries, but important around the world as well. US dollars, pounds, euros, Japanese yen. I mean, that almost sums it up. You have a few others sprinkled in as well. But these are the currencies that are in this kind of close-knit financial cabal that extends to the kind of international stage. And I would say the American dollar oversees everything else. The US dollar, sort of like petroleum, sort of like gold, it's taken on that role of the international currency, that one thing that everybody wants all around the world. This has been the case, I would say, since about the mid-20th century. The US dollar is one of those currencies that is always valuable everywhere at all times. Now, it's not true of every country's currency. We might be led to believe that it is, but it's not necessarily the case. You see some currencies, total amounts of money. You've got 10 euros, 10 US dollars, 8,000 krona from Iceland, 10 pounds from the Bank of England. And there is this idea that all of these amounts are worth roughly the same, which I guess you could say is true. But nonetheless, some currencies are more powerful than others. American dollars, for instance, are this kind of major international currency. Why would that be the case? Why would US dollars be more powerful? Well, because they're backed by the American state. I mean, that's basically the underlying reason. Think of America with its superpower status, its vast military apparatus, its kind of a giant economy. The entire American state stands behind the currency and thus supports it, props it up, ensures that this IOU slip, which is what money essentially is, that this IOU slip truly is worth something. Countries that are linked closely to America enjoy the same privilege and status. Not so for countries that are kind of outside of that. There you have the currencies of a couple of other countries. You have 5,000 won from North Korea and $100 trillion from the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. This was indeed an amount that was created during a period of hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, $100 trillion. I don't know exactly how much that was worth, but not a lot on international markets, probably 50 cents. That's basically what it amounts to. What happened there? Well, the Bank of Zimbabwe is engaging in its own currency printing operation. It too is generating money, make people feel richer, make them feel wealthier. Yes, but people don't actually believe that the Zimbabwean state has the money. The IOU is no good in that situation because people are saying, well, you're the one standing behind this, and I don't really believe you're that wealthy. I don't really believe that you have the backing here. So too for something like the North Korean currency. North Korea does have its own currency, but it's not really worth anything. Not worth anything on international markets, hardly even worth anything even in the country itself. People who are wealthy in North Korea, that of course is a relative term, but usually people who are wealthy in North Korea are those who have access to foreign currency, especially US dollars. There's one of those kinds of underlying stories. This rogue state, the DPRK, is actually run on American dollars, at least in terms of buying anything that you might class as being luxury goods. Why is that? Well, because American dollars are always valuable. Doesn't matter where you are in the world. Doesn't matter what rogue state you're in. If you have US dollars, then you know you have something that's worth something. But conversely, same issue with the North Korean state's currency. There's this idea of saying, well, this regime, I don't believe you have this wealth. I don't believe you're actually backing this or supporting this. You see this in terms of official currency holdings around the world. Different countries want these valuable currencies. They want to hold on to them. And there you see the most popular currencies held worldwide, which is a function of both the relative strength of these countries and also their alliances with the U.S. Overwhelmingly, U.S. dollars. Foreign currency reserves, that's what they are. You have some euros in there as well. And you have a couple of other currencies thrown in there as well. You got some Canadian dollars, Aussie dollars, Swiss francs, etc. But note that it's not a kind of wide range when you get down to it. The story of the Chinese yuan is actually kind of an interesting one because that's the question of how powerful the Chinese currency will be in the future on international markets because China has recently turned into this economic superpower, this juggernaut. That's a recent development. So will the Chinese currency also start to play this role? That's a kind of interesting question moving forward. Okay, so what happens when a country undergoes a financial crisis and it's not necessarily holding a currency that is valuable internationally, but nonetheless is allied with countries like Britain and America? Well, this brings us into the story of the Icelandic financial crisis, which ran parallel to the larger international crisis in 2008. As I mentioned, economists have been looking at this crisis for a while, and I think they'll be looking at it for a long time in the future because, first of all, it provides a case study in a country that, proportionally speaking, had just about the most massive financial meltdown of any nation. But underlying that, too, is the story that Iceland is a country that controls its own currency. And at the time, I think it was the smallest country in the world that had its own currency. I'm not sure if it still is, but that was the case at the time. And that's even more idiosyncratic, I guess is the word, when you think about its participation in the European economic area, because you have countries like Germany and France, which are much larger, but they don't have their own currency per se. They're in the euro instead. So this is a kind of interesting side note in the way currency actually functions in a country's links to the international financial market. In the lead up to 2007 and 2008, Iceland's three major banks, Kaupthing, Glitnir, and Landsbanken, took advantage of their high credit range to expand their balance sheets and borrow large amounts of foreign credit to the point where their cumulative debts were up to 11 times the size of the entire country's GDP. So that's the total wealth that's being produced in the country. The amount of money that they're owing is 11 times higher than the total wealth that's even being produced in the country at the time. And they were borrowing foreign credit. Okay, so foreign currency, like euros and dollars, not krona, but it's foreign currency. Now, this was sort of a product of the general climate of rampant borrowing and consumption that existed at the time. The reason it spiraled out of control in Iceland in this way is because the GDP of the country itself is very small. So it's easy to exceed these amounts. Not, of course, because Iceland is poor, but because the population is very small. So the total amount of wealth being produced is not going to be an enormous amount. So this was sort of in line with what was happening in Europe already, but just got out of hand to a greater degree. Collapse of Lehman Brothers on September 15, 2008 poisoned the world economy, creating a chain reaction that shut off multinational banks' access to foreign credit. With their immense debts in foreign currency suddenly coming due, Glitnir appealed to Central Bank of Iceland for a 600 million euro bailout. So basically what that means is one of the banks in Iceland had borrowed a huge amount of money in foreign currency, 600 million euros. They didn't have that money, and so they appealed to the central bank saying, we can't possibly pay back this loan. We need you, the central bank, the last backstop in the country, to pay the money back for us. The issue here was that the central bank doesn't have that kind of money, or they did, but not to the degree necessary. Probably the central bank's holdings in euros at this time was something like 2 or 3 billion euros. So you consider that's a huge chunk of the money that the central bank has on hand that would be used to pay back just one loan from one of the banks. And there are other loans coming due as well at the time. The Central Bank of Iceland can, of course, produce plenty of krona, right? It could produce krona till the end of time, right? Give us all millions and millions of krona because that's the local currency, but not true of foreign currency. And the central bank countered by taking over Glitnir, effectively nationalizing the bank. And you see the Icelandic Prime Minister giving his famous "God bless Iceland" speech, one of those speeches that probably produced the opposite of its intended effect, right? Unfortunately, by taking over Glitnir and trimming its asset base, that incited anger from shareholders in the process. The central bank merely exposed its inability to bail out one of Iceland's major banks, let alone three. That's effectively what really triggered the financial crisis here. By nationalizing the bank, the central bank is basically saying to the international community, well, this bank is not worth that amount of money. They can't pay it back. Not only that, but we can't pay it back either. That's why we're basically placing the bank under our care. And so this is exactly what makes everyone in the international market jittery about Iceland, because there's this message coming that the country itself doesn't have the kind of foreign currency necessary to meet these loans. So they're going to default on all of it. All that money is going to disappear. Nobody is actually getting their loan payments back. I'm sure that this was a factor in the WOW Airlines situation. Because remember when WOW Airlines was going under not so long ago, and there was this story about nationalizing the airline, or Iceland Air was going to purchase it, but they didn't do that in the end. And I'm sure that it was partly in response to what happened in 2008. What happened? They just let the company fail instead, and it was kind of resurrected as play down the line. This in itself, the collapse of all three of the banks, would happen, as I said, remarkably quickly. That would have been something in and of itself. But what really put the financial crisis sort of on the front page of the news was the IceSave debacle, which was linked to it. And so it actually ended up involving people in other countries. People in Iceland, of course, had to deal with the fallout of this in their own way, but there were people in Britain and the Netherlands as well. Initiated by Landsbanken, Iceland was a savings account made available in Britain and the Netherlands, which promised high interest rates, such as the advertised 6.2% backed by strong credit ratings, basically inviting people overseas, predominantly in Britain, to put their savings, their money, into this foreign bank. Why? Because it has ridiculously high interest rates. That is very high for an interest rate, just to hold your money in the bank. And they also had very strong credit ratings, which is kind of a mark of approval. But strong credit ratings largely because they had never been involved in international finance before. About 300,000 British people, ranging from hospitals to charities to private citizens, invested over £5 billion. Well, when the financial crisis hit, Landsbanken doesn't actually have this money anymore. In fact, none of the banks have money, and so people logging into their accounts are confronted with this message, which basically tells them they're not processing any deposits or any withdrawals. In other words, you can't get your money out of this account. The money doesn't really exist anymore, right? We don't have it anymore. In fact, none of us have any money right now. This triggered a kind of panic-stricken reaction, and it really gives you a sense of the culture, the climate at the time when Gordon Brown and the British government invoked anti-terrorist legislation that had been passed in 2001, in the wake of 9/11, to bring about Landsbanki Freezing Order 2008. That was basically legislation that it was designed to intervene into the Icelandic economy to try and get money back to British citizens. This was an emergency measure that basically classified Iceland as a terrorist nation alongside the likes of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in order to seize financial assets. There you see an online petition in response to this, which garnered over 80,000 signatures. Obviously, this could only be described as a very hostile act on the part of the British government. I mean, well, first of all, Britain is one of Iceland's biggest trading partners. Second of all, Britain and Iceland are NATO allies. Third of all, Iceland doesn't even have a military. And fourth of all, Iceland is ranked #1 in the global peace index. So clearly an antagonistic act for all of those reasons. But it certainly gives you a sense of the climate at the time, the kind of panicky response. This is sort of the equivalent. I mean, this kind of moment for individuals. It's kind of the equivalent of hearing for a long time about food shortages in a place, and then you walk into the grocery store one day and the shelves are picked clean. There's absolutely nothing in there. And so the reaction of people is, oh my God, it's true. There really is this giant crisis going on. And so there's this immediate rush, this kind of panicky reaction that occurred. But the other thing that this did, in addition to showing the kind of level of fear at the time, it also undermines anti-terrorist legislation. Basically makes it look as though this legislation is just in place to bully countries into doing what they want to do. So it kind of delegitimizes legislation that had been passed in response to organizations like Al-Qaeda or a government like the Taliban. I want to summarize the aftermath of this. Obviously, you may or may not remember this, but the kind of major aftermath of this was the drop in the value of Iceland's currency for a long time subsequently, where it's not worth a lot on international markets, which has since turned around, thanks in no small part to the tourist industry, which took off subsequently. The great thing with tourism, which Iceland has obviously discovered since then, is it brings in a lot of foreign currency into the country. When you have a country that is situated between North America and Britain and Europe, well, you have all these people coming into the country, and guess what? They're bringing dollars, euros, and pounds into the country, and so all these people who are visiting will be staying at hotels, going to restaurants, going on tours to volcanoes and glaciers, and obviously don't forget to spend, right, as long as you're here. So it makes a big difference in increasing the amount of foreign currency that exists within the nation. Iceland still has its own currency to this day. That was a point of debate. I guess it still is a kind of point of debate going on as to whether that's a good or a bad thing. There's talk about them entering the euro or even the Canadian dollar at one point. And the endlessly debated question is this a good or a bad thing? Well, I should start out by saying something that is probably self-evident, but still needs to be said, that this is the decision of the Icelandic people. This is something that if people were to make this decision would be decided, I think, democratically, not as a backroom deal or through a bunch of financial officers. We could still put the question to, say, an economist or a professor and say, well, is it a good or a bad thing? Well, sorry to give you the cop-out answer, but that depends, right? It kind of depends on a whole slew of different factors. Good and bad thing. It really just depends on the situation. Obviously, access to foreign currency, when you have this kind of centralized cabal of international finance, is always going to be important. Access to euros, pounds, and US dollars, because those are the kind of money that exists on the international scale. That's always going to be important. But the thing with Iceland having its own currency is it got out of the financial crisis much quicker than other countries. Exercising control over the flow of currency in the country can be a good thing. Consider the contrast to the situation in Greece, where there was the Greek economic crisis, basically a depression that lasted for something like 10 years. It wouldn't have been as bad for Greece if they were not in the euro, because they're not able to control their own finances in that situation. Now, the euro was not the cause of the Greek financial crisis, not for a second, but it was a factor in the way that that crisis dragged on subsequently. So we talked about kind of issues that touch upon individual people's lives, issues that extend up to the kind of national and international level. Now, here at the end, I'm just going to introduce a kind of different side of the economy, which doesn't necessarily have to do with resources or money, but is obviously no less important. Here we're going to just talk about labor, about work, the kinds of people that work, the kinds of work that people do. A couple subjects to think about there. Bringing manufacturing jobs back to Britain, America, and Western Europe at large. Automation and robotics in both manufacturing and the service economy. Two perspectives on the future of labor and the gig economy and the precariat. See an image of a garment factory in Bangladesh that collapsed in 2013, killing over 1,000 workers who were there. Structural faults have been noted in the building beforehand, but the owners ordered the workers to remain on site. The factory was making garments for many well-known Western-based companies, including Walmart, Versace, Gucci, Prada, and others. This has been the story of offshoring labor for a very long time. Mentioned previously that there isn't the same manufacturing base in a country like the UK that there used to be. Increasingly, they don't produce a lot of the products that they once did make at home. But nonetheless, consumption certainly hasn't gone anywhere. It's not as though people in Britain have quit buying any kind of consumer item such as clothing, electronics, furniture, toys, cars, whatever it might be, right? People are still buying all of those products. The difference is a lot of the time they're not being produced at home. They're not being produced in the country where they're being purchased. Rather, they are being produced overseas in countries like Bangladesh or China or Vietnam or any one of a number of different places. You can see that. You check the tags on your clothing and notice that a lot of the times it's actually being produced somewhere else, being shipped over here. So why is that the case? Well, companies have become obsessed with this idea of offshoring labor and having these factories overseas in other places, as I said, in places like Bangladesh and Vietnam. Is it really because the people in these countries have a knack for producing these different consumer products? No, it's because they don't pay the workers as much. I mean, that is the basic reason when you get down to it. These companies, Walmart, Versace, and Gucci, regard labor in a country like Britain, or Iceland for that matter, as being too expensive. The workers are too expensive. The unions make it too expensive. You can get a lot of cheap labor in other countries and basically pay the people there much less. And not only that, but you have a much laxer regulations, safety regulations, even in these various places, because consider the fallout, the end result of this kind of practice going on in a country like Britain. So there's been this rush towards offshoring labor. Now, in theory, A country like Britain would probably be glad to get some of this manufacturing capacity back in its own nation. It would rather have a kind of solid, tangible base. And obviously, these corporations will be glad to get rid of the bad publicity. I don't know if they actually care about the workers themselves, but they don't want the bad PR that comes out of this. And if you look at the situation in the United States, Donald Trump actually kind of ran on a platform of bringing manufacturing jobs back to America. He spoke endlessly about that, about America losing these kinds of jobs overseas and bringing them back home. So is that actually something that's going to happen in the future? Well, manufacturing, production might actually return to America and Britain in the future, but I suspect it won't come back in the form of jobs that people will perform in factories. What I think is going to happen is the processes will become increasingly automated. And so what you'll see instead are machinery and robotics taking on these tasks, these jobs that people used to do. People are still doing to an extent today, but there's certainly this growing trend towards this idea of automating these procedures. This has happened previously on a kind of smaller scale. Machinery has long since been introduced to manufacturing, such as on assembly lines in car plants. But such machines have typically been programmed to repeat just one task over and over, so too they usually are segregated from the human workers to avoid the risk of injury. So in car plant manufacturing, you have these giant machines that you build. They're not super sophisticated. They just kind of perform one task in this repetitive way. And there's these big kind of unwieldy machines that people don't stand close to. So this kind of automation has been occurring. Make no mistake, companies would be very happy to do this because, yes, they have to build the machines. Yes, they have to maintain the machines, but they don't have to pay the machines. That's a kind of important thing. Once you have this process of automation going, you have this kind of automated, perfect worker bot, doesn't need to be paid, doesn't go on strike, doesn't slack off at work, doesn't take coffee breaks, doesn't do anything, right? Just always works at the exact same pace. And that's why you see this trend increasing over time. New levels, I would say, of sophistication and intricacy being introduced into this process of automated production. You see agricultural robots, such as these drones, are introducing new levels of automation to farming, robots that can eliminate weeds, pick fruit, analyze the quality of crops, which are now entering mass production. This process will likely eliminate a variety of jobs, including many that are filled by migrant laborers, people who traditionally work in things like fruit picking. Again, the problem with automating the process previously, robots a bit too unwieldy. They would just damage the fruit that they're trying to pick. But they're becoming kind of finer and more delicate, more advanced and complex in their workings, to the point where you really can have robots that can do these finer, intricate tasks, thus you don't actually need people to do them for you anymore. So one example of something that could be entering industry that exists today. We see aspects of this trend. I mean, it's not kind of existing on its full scale, not existing to the level that it could, but we certainly see elements of it being introduced, such as in automated checkout counters in grocery stores. Technology has increased to the point where you actually can just scan the items yourself and also bag the groceries yourself, and the computer, the machine, is able to basically verify that you are paying for the product that you're purchasing. You see checkout counters which greatly reduce the number of employees needed at stores. They're becoming the norm for many companies worldwide. So you can see these being introduced at Cronin or Bonus. You have a big line of these automated machines, and from the company's perspective, the great thing about them is they require less labor. You can keep one or two checkout counters open for those people who want the human touch when they're going through line, but you only really need one person working a series of automated counters to fix the machine when it goes haywire. That's it, just one person for 6 or 7 or 8 of these automated machines. So you see the kind of the reduction of the human presence in the labor process and increasingly automating it or making it available to computers. So, yes, we'll leave it there today. So, you won't be responsible for the rest of the slides in this section after this, but certainly study the material I've talked about today. Take the test on Monday, and I'll see you next week.